Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. I want to thank everyone for joining the 2022 Improving CSP webinar series. This year, we're going to focus on security and password authentication. We've got a number of different events in line for the Passwordless authentication series. And Chris Lee will be presenting today, and the Q&A will be open. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the session. And if you have questions, please post them there. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. All right. Well, again, everyone, appreciate you joining in on our session today. Our first of four that is going to make up our passwordless authentication mini-series. And we are starting with an introduction to passwordless authentication. So kind of an overview of what it is, why we need it. And then we are going to dive into some of the individual authenticator options in our upcoming sessions. So starting with Windows Hello for Business, and then also the Microsoft Authenticator and FIDO security keys. So Windows Hello for Business is kind of a bigger topic, which warranted two sessions for it on its own. But as part of this series, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we cover what passwordless authentication is and why it's beneficial, but also how to use it. So we want to make sure you understand all the bits and pieces that work underneath the hood. But as part of these additional sessions coming up, we will be going through hands-on demonstration of how to set up these things in your environment so you can start taking advantage of passwordless authentication. So for today's session, quick agenda on what we're going to talk about. So we're going to start off with, why are passwords bad? We want to set the stage, why passwordless is even needed. Why are we even talking about this topic today? Why should we all be considering it? And then I'll dive into what it is and how it works. So hopefully by the end of the session today, you'll have a better understanding of how this actually works behind the scenes. Even though when you go to use it, it might just be a simple, facial scan or whatnot. So it's very straightforward and unobtrusive when you actually use passwordless authentication. But there's a lot of stuff that actually happens in the background, and having a good understanding of what all that stuff is I think is going to be beneficial to deploying it in your environment. So let's go ahead and get started. Excuse me. So again, before we can dive into why passwordless authentication is such a good thing, we do need to understand what's the problem we're trying to solve. And simply put, as this slide says, passwords are just bad, essentially. When we think about user credentials, we often think of a combination of two things: a username and a password. Now, these are just two strings of characters that need to be combined, but in most cases, our usernames are out there for everyone to see, because in most cases, our usernames are simply our email addresses. So that gives bad actors 50% of what they need to compromise our accounts. The second half is just another string of characters. That's all a password really is. It's just one piece of information that we know. So the problem with that is that if it's something that we know, it's something that someone else can know as well, right? Knowledge is transferable, knowledge is guessable. So it doesn't really make passwords that secure. So as a good security practice, we want to have something that is not just secure, but also convenient when we look at credentials. If it's not convenient, that's often going to lead to bad habits or bad practices, which entirely undercut any security that we're putting in place anyways. Passwords are typically considered convenient because they're things that we can, or we should be able to remember. But passwords are technically very low in security because several things that we'll actually get into on the upcoming slides. But as we go through the rest of the slides here, we want to talk about our goal is to increase our security while I'm getting tongue-tied here. We want to increase our security while also increasing our convenience. Because as I said, when passwords are inconvenient, bad practices pop up. when we create a password, we want to create something that is convenient, right? But that makes it something easy for us to remember. Unfortunately, convenient means insecure. The password summer 2022 may be a very easy password to remember, but it's also not very secure. Having a password that is 24 characters long, randomly generated using letters, numbers, special characters, that may be a more secure password, but it's probably going to be something that you can't remember. So the convenience factor goes way low. So with passwords, we've tried to play in this space that's somewhere between these two ends of the spectrum here that's shown on the slide. We're trying to play in a space to where we have rememberable passwords, but they're secure, and those things don't often align with each other. So what we tried to do is put in password policy requirements, and there's really three areas that really go into password policies, and that's password length, complexity, and password age. And as we dive through this, the next couple slides, we'll kind of see why none of these really have much of an impact at all on password security. So the first misconception that I want to go over is that a longer password is a stronger password. Now, I'll admit that this is probably the only item that actually has some potential to make a stronger password. But length does not equal strength. The most common practice is to require a password that is at least 8 characters in length, but technically longer is better. But remember, it's human nature to avoid inconvenience. So the longer we make passwords, the more likely we're going to have people do things to make remembering those passwords much easier. For example, repeating a short password twice may increase the overall length. And I've got the example up here, password. Yeah, that's definitely a lot longer than just, the 8 characters that make up the word password, but it really doesn't make it any more secure. In fact, this may actually result in weaker passwords as we require people to have long passwords. The end result is probably going to be we have weaker passwords. And that might sound a little strange, but let's say you have a password policy that requires 18 characters. What you're going to end up with is that your users are going to try to come up with the simplest 18-character password possible. They're not going to use a 19-character password. They're not going to use a 20-character password. Their password is going to be 18 characters because that's a lot of characters to try to make into a password. So that pretty much makes the assumption that everyone in your organization is going to have a password that is exactly 18 characters long. Now that makes it much easier for bad actors as they can assume every password will be 18 characters, and therefore they don't have to try as many combinations that include anything but 18-character passwords. So this is going to actually reduce the amount of effort, reduce the number of potential character combinations that bad actors have to try, because if they know your password, your policy length is 18 characters, they're going to say, hey, I'm only going to try passwords that are 18 characters. In fact, I have a link here at the bottom, but there was a study by Carnegie Mellon University that found that even with longer passwords being created using things like passphrases or sentence-like structures, with the sole intent to increase the length of the password, it really had no benefit whatsoever to password security. Now, you may have seen this cartoon before, this comic before, because it tries to demonstrate length is good for passwords. It tries to demonstrate that length is going to be much more valuable than complexity. But technically, the cartoon here is true. The longer the password, the more potential character combinations that could make up that password. So therefore, theoretically, the more guesses that would be needed to try to break that password. But the reality is today that, the tools that are available, the computing power that is available, this cartoon depicts trying 1,000 guesses per second. And that's just not the reality. We're seeing more of billions of guesses per second, if not more. So with the availability of password cracking tools, how easy they are and readily available they are, not just for bad things or bad actors, but they're there for legitimate use, such as law enforcement or government use. So bad length of password here is not necessarily going to be equivalent to security.
Hey, Chris, there was a question asked around the 100 billion passwords per second attempts. Kind of how is that even possible, or is that real?
Yeah. So that's a good point, because that does seem absurd, right? 100 billion passwords. What I have listed up here on the slide, 100 billion passwords a second. If you're talking about cloud, trying to break into cloud accounts, yeah, 100 billion is not going to be realistic. But what we'll talk about are some of the types of attacks, and where this really comes into play is with brute force attacks in an offline scenario. So I have a slide on that, and we'll address that. But that is accurate that 100 billion guesses per second against the cloud, probably not going to happen. Probably isn't realistic, but it is realistic for offline based attacks. So we'll get to that here. Okay. So the second misconception is that complexity increases the password strength. If we think about the English alphabet and the character encoded on our keyboards, we have 26 uppercase and 26 lowercase letters, and then we have 10 numbers or digits to choose from. So that equates to 62 total characters that can make up our passwords. But if we add in all those non-letter characters or those non-number characters, what we call special characters, that adds about 32 more characters into the pool. So choosing from a pool of 94-ish characters versus 62 characters significantly increases the total number of unique combinations for characters in a password. But this technically does not result in a more, well, technically it does result in a more complex password, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be stronger. So it's something I've already mentioned. Going back to human nature, we try to make things as easy on ourselves as possible. So when we add password complexity requirements, it makes passwords harder to remember. So what do we often do? Well, we start substituting common special characters for similar letters, like using the $ for S, the @ sign for A, an exclamation point for I, and so on. The downside to that is that it's predictable. Bad actors know that that is human nature. That's what we're going to do. So they can use that predictability to generate passwords that have a higher probability of being right. They can use those simple letter substitutions in passphrases and increase their overall probability of guessing your password. That, and coupled with the increased computing power that I mentioned before with password cracking tools, the complexity requirement is not so much a roadblock anymore for bad actors. It's more of a, kind of a mild rumble strip at best. So complexity isn't going to have the amount of impact that I think we've all been led to believe it has. And then finally, the last misconception is that expiring passwords or having users change their passwords on a more frequent basis results in strong passwords. And to be clear, the only thing that this accomplishes is training your users to maintain the most simple password that they can, which equates to the weakest password that they can. So I get that some of you may have regulatory or compliance requirements that dictate you must have your users change their passwords on a regular basis, but the reality is that this is just old, outdated thinking. And unfortunately, some of these governing bodies just don't understand the cybersecurity practices or the impacts that changing a password really does have. So if you think about it, if you require your users to have a password that is 10 characters and minimum 10 character length password, has minimum complexity requirements, and they're required to change it every 30 days. And then you also put some password history in there saying, hey, you can't reuse the last 12 passwords that they've had. You know, your users are going to hate your password policy. They're not going to be happy about it. You know, they may start out with a relatively strong password, but every 30 days when they're forced to change it, they're going to start doing things to make it as easy as possible for themselves to remember. This is where things like rotating passwords or patterns come into play. You know, if my password is April at 2022, and next month I might have to change it, and I change it to at May 2022, and then the following month, next 30 days, I have to change it again, and I change it to 2022 June at symbol, and and so on for the remainder of every month this year. You know, my pattern is simply using a month, or maybe even a season like spring and summer, but combining it with the same special character, the at symbol, in the year. You know, I may forget what my current password is, right? I mean, is it April at 2022? Is it 2022 at April? You know, I might forget what my password is, but I can guess it pretty easily because I know what my combination is, what my pattern is, right? I know it's going to be a month, the at symbol, in the year. So I have pretty much 3 things I have to put in the right order. Not very hard. And the problem with that is that bad actors also recognize that this is a human habit. We're making things easy on ourselves, and as we fall into these patterns, bad actors know that, hey, let's make logical predictions. Let's make passwords that are more likely, more, have a higher probability of being correct. Just we're reducing the number of guesses they have to make because we're following a pattern that is very predictable. We just made their jobs a lot easier. So even studies, Microsoft has a study out there that has shown that the first password you have your user create is most likely going to be the strongest password they ever use for their account. So, in reality, why make them change it if it's only going to get weaker over time? But even assume that you still require your users to change their passwords. What does changing it even accomplish? All this does, this change in the password, all it does is, in the event that someone has already compromised your account, now changing your password assumes that that person who's compromised your account can no longer log into your account. The reality is that if someone has compromised your account, they're not waiting 30 or 60 or 90 days to start using it. They're going to use it immediately. And the first thing that they're going to do is try to establish some degree of persistence, something that allows them to maintain their degree of access, even if you change your password. So even if that's just setting up a means for them to go in and change your password themselves. So again, what benefit does frequent password changes really provide? So we, mentioned the brute force attack, but I did want to talk about some of the most common credential-based attacks out there. But as we talk about these attacks, it'll also become a little bit more clear why, regardless of what we set up for your password, it really doesn't matter. So even if we had strong passwords, some of these attacks really don't care. It doesn't matter how strong your password is. So let's take a look at some of them. And the first one I have up here is in bright red is phishing. It's also known as the man-in-the-middle attack or credential interception. But the reason why it is bright red and top of the screen and very big is because it is the most successful type of attack today. So if you are going to have someone in your organization compromised, most likely it will be because of phishing. So if you look at the volume of phishing email out there, if you're not familiar with what phishing is, let me take a step back. If you're not familiar with what phishing is, it's mostly an email-based social campaign or email-based campaign to try to trick people into clicking on a malicious link that takes them to a login page for some service that you use, right? It could be Office 365, it could be Salesforce, it could be Dropbox, whatever it might be. It takes you to a fake login page and tries to trick you to put your username and password in, therefore allowing someone to steal your credentials. So this is very common today. And if you think about the trillions of email messages that get sent on a daily basis, phishing accounts for over 0.5% of all of that email. And 0.5% sounds like a very low percentage. But again, we're talking about trillions of email messages per day. So that 0.5 is a lot of email. Another type of credential attack is called credential stuffing. This leverages, this is also very common, but this leverages previous successful breaches, right? Maybe there's been a hack and a bunch of username and passwords have been posted to some dark website or some dictionary for a purchase somewhere. But the foundation of this type of attack is that the credentials have already been stolen by somebody else. And this is just using credential stuffing. It's called, also known as breach replay or list cleaning. Not really sure where the list cleaning comes in, but I get breach replay. It's trying to use those previously compromised accounts to try to log in. That's all it is. And this is very common. In fact, Microsoft, they see over 20 million accounts being probed by credentials that have been found on previously compromised lists. Another item here is keystroke login. This is definitely less common these days, and this is malware-based or virus-based type of attack. And it's pretty much just tracking all the key presses on your keyboard. So if you type in your username, you type in your password, that's being logged somewhere and sent off to some bad actor. The reason why this is definitely less common today is because of anti-malware, antivirus software on your endpoints. It's a little bit easier to detect now with good endpoint security. Social recon is still out there, even though this is still uncommon. You might kind of remember this as the dumpster diving or the network scanning. But the key to this is that you need to have physical access. Searching someone's office for passwords written down. Again, going back to human nature, a complex password is going to try to, someone's going to try to make it as easy as on themselves to remember that password, and they're probably going to write it down on a Post-it note and stick it under their keyboard because no one would ever look under the keyboard or the mouse pad, or worse yet, when you see it stuck to the monitor itself. But social recon is just walking around an office, seeing whose passwords are just out freely to grab. It might be scanning network file shares. Maybe there's some automation scripts that have embedded usernames and passwords in them to authenticate to some service. So definitely less common, mostly because it does require some degree of physical access for the most part, but still a realistic type of attack. And I mentioned brute force before. These are offline attacks, so kind of a little bit different than the other attacks that we've talked about. This is also known as database extraction or cracking. These are more low frequency because it does require some data to be stolen first. Whether it's the Active Directory database or if it's some application database with identities. Regardless of what it is, some data has to be stolen and in the physical possession of the bad actor, and then they can run their cracking tools against that data using the cracking tools that they have available to them and the processing power, and that's where you can get up to 100 billion password attempts per second because of the scalability of these tools. And again, when you're hitting an offline data source, you have that ability to attempt that many guesses per second. And then the last one I'm going to call out here because it is very common is password spray. This is just kind of guessing or hammering, or I like the one low and slow attack because password spray attacks, and I'll actually demonstrate this or show this a little bit more clear on the next slide, is just trying to guess a bunch of passwords across a very large population of user accounts. So this does account for about 16% of all attacks out there, so it is very common. So we should be aware of it. But out of all of these attacks, whether you have a very long and complex password, for the most part, has no impact, especially around phishing, credential stuffing, keystroke login, social recon. In all of those scenarios, the bad actors, they know what your exact password is. Either you've given it to them because you've fallen victim of phishing, or it's been previously compromised, or they're tracking it via a keystroke logger, they're seeing you type it in, or they found it because you wrote it down somewhere. In all of those cases, it doesn't matter if you had a 64-character password with every character possible. They know exactly what your password is, so it doesn't matter. So let's take a look at the two types of attacks where your password actually has some relevance. And the first one is a password spray attack. And again, this type of attack is it's an online attack, but this is where easily guessable or commonly used passwords are attempted across thousands or millions of accounts at once. So having a password that is more complex, that is longer, less likely to be used by anyone else, it does improve the chances that this attack will not be as successful. But the bad actor, these attempts are being done against millions of accounts, and they only need one to be successful. So we do have some tools available to us, especially on the Microsoft Cloud side, that helps address these types of attacks. And the main one is account lockout thresholds. So if you're not familiar with account lockout thresholds, if the wrong password is entered too many times, then the account locks out for a period of time and no other logins can be attempted. Now on the Microsoft side, they have a little bit more intelligence built into this. So, a bad actor sitting over in a foreign country trying your password too many times doesn't lock you out of being productive and able to log in. It's got some intelligence built around it, so it's only locking out the bad actor and not legitimate use. This does, the account lockout thresholds does drastically reduce the success rate of these password spray attacks, because if you set a password lockout policy to 3 bad password attempts every hour, that means only 72 passwords can be tried against a single account each day. But again, it's an attacker trying to attack millions of accounts or thousands of accounts at once. They just need one to be successful to make it worth their time. And then the second type of attack where your password has any relevance is that brute force attack. Again, that is an offline based attack where the attacker has access to some file or repository that has credentials, and they're pretty much just trying to run tools offline to crack that password. This is where they can run these tools at a large magnitude, large scale, that aren't impacted by lockout thresholds or other online countermeasures that we may have available to us. So in this case, the reality is the only factor that's going to slow down the attacker is the password length. Again, I'm not trying to contradict myself from the previous statements that the length doesn't matter that much, but in this specific use case, length is the only thing that's really going to have a noticeable impact. Based on today's computing power, it's unlikely though that even very long passwords will remain uncracked. But the thought or the standard out there is that the minimum 12 characters, that's when you start to see the return on these brute force attacks kind of to diminish, right? The 12 characters kind of makes it difficult for a bad actor with a reasonable amount of time running cracking tools on a reasonable amount of hardware or capacity. Just not worth their time. And the keyword there being reasonable, because if the attacker is well funded, they can buy much more computing power and it makes it a lot easier for them. But reasonable being what's realistic out there today. So let's move on past passwords, and you might be thinking, well, that's why we have multi-factor authentication. There's no secret out. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you've probably pitched or encouraged others in your organization that, hey, we have to all be using multi-factor authentication. Or maybe you've been told, hey, you have to use multi-factor authentication. But it's a great security measure. Don't get me wrong. Using MFA is the most impactful identity security measure you can take to strengthen your identity security. And the main reason for that is even studies shown by Microsoft have seen it prevent over 99% of credential-based attacks. So definitely use MFA. I'm not trying to discourage anyone from it, so don't take that message away. But if you're not familiar with with multi-factor authentication, what the concept is a combination of three things. You have to provide at least 2 out of 3 things. Something that you know, which is the password that we've talked about a lot here in the last few slides. Something that you have, such as like a mobile device or a hardware token. And then something that you are, like biometrics, a fingerprint, a facial scan. So even though MFA adds a high level of security, unfortunately, most people view it as being very inconvenient. That's maybe a personal opinion for some people, but overall, that's kind of the feedback that we see, is that most people view it as inconvenient. But despite this, and although it's rarely compromised, MFA does have some potential vulnerabilities based on how MFA is performed. And to be clear, again, these attacks are very rare, but that doesn't necessarily make them any less real. As of last year, less than 10% of enterprise accounts were detected of even being protected with MFA. So, this has really not been a roadblock for bad actors or attackers out there, because they haven't necessarily had to get around it in the past. But as we start adopting MFA as more of common practice, everyone starts adopting it. Attackers are going to have to adjust. They're going to evolve as well. So they're going to start exploiting things like what we're going to talk about here with channel jacking and real-time phishing. So the downside with MFA is that it only verifies the control of the communication channel. It doesn't necessarily provide any additional verification of your specific identity. So, for example, a push notification on a mobile app, or a one-time passcode via SMS, or even a phone call prompting for a key press, it doesn't necessarily verify that you are who you say you are. You're only verifying that you're able to receive and respond to some kind of a prompt. So it doesn't prove your identity any further outside of the credentials that you've already provided. It just simply, again, proves that you can receive a notification like a text or a phone call and respond to it. So, this results in 2 types of potential attacks. I mentioned channel jacking, and this is where the communication channel itself is taken over, or real-time phishing. This is where bad actors insert themselves into the communication channel itself. So the diagram here helps explain the real-time phishing concept, where a man-in-the-middle attacker intercepts communication on the channel, like an SMS message, and then replays it to the authenticating service. This is definitely more of a complex type of attack and a lot more effort on the attacker's side, and it is less likely to be used than channel jacking. So channel jacking, on the other hand, is taking over the communication channel itself. So this could be something as simple as, hey, I just stole your mobile phone. So when you get that push notification, I can either tap, or you get that SMS notification, now I can type in the one-time passcode via SMS, or answer the phone call. But this could also be something, if you recall back in the day, there's a telecommunications vulnerability called the SS7 vulnerability. And this still is realistic today, even in the mobile phone realm today, because it's also known as SIM cloning. I can clone a SIM card, and the telecommunication network thinks there's only one device out there receiving the signal, that SMS signal or that phone call, but I can pop that cloned SIM into another device and receive the exact same call, the exact same SMS message. So that's an example of what channel jacking would be, and probably more likely to be the case than the real-time phishing, man in the middle. But either way, those are vulnerabilities that we have with how MFA is performed today. So I've spoken a lot, but hopefully to this point, I've made a strong case as to why passwords should not be used, and why even MFA, though very strong, can still be vulnerable. So, this hopefully also provides the background on the details on why passwordless has become the next state for identity security, and the problem that we intend to solve with it. So passwordless moves away from having users having to remember traditional passwords entirely. Because of this, it is a method that is considered very convenient among users, but it's also very secure. And we're going to dive into the technical details here in a minute, but at a very high level, passwordless authentication is a form of multi-factor authentication that replaces passwords with 2 or more verification factors secured and encrypted using hardware-based security. You couldn't tell I read that, that's a very long definition. But to boil it down, that pretty much says passwordless is a strong credential that uses hardware security technology. One thing that we want to make clear is that passwordless is not just a Microsoft technology, even though they are very staunch supporters and are contributing to the development of the standards that go into passwordless. Passwordless is based on industry standards being developed by the FastID Online or FIDO Alliance. So we'll talk about that, especially in our last session with the FIDO2 security keys. But the key takeaway here is that this is not just Microsoft developing the solution. This is a standard. And that means passwordless is not just tied to Microsoft solutions, but will be something that can be used universally across platforms and solutions from other members of that FIDO Alliance as well. So passwordless authentication is based on asymmetric key cryptography. We're going to dive into the technical nuts and bolts here in a minute, as I said. But what this means is that passwordless is based on the concept of a cryptographic key pair, a private key and a public key. The private key is generated on the hardware device itself, and it is secured to that device. It's unique to that device, and it never leaves that device. While there's a corresponding public key that gets registered with the service you're trying to authenticate to. These keys are not the same as a username and password combination. In fact, there's no password associated with passwordless credentials, thus the name passwordless. There are 3 types of passwordless authentication methods when it comes to at least the Microsoft space, and that's going to be Windows Hello for Business, the Microsoft Authenticator app, and using FIDO2 security keys. So we have upcoming sessions on each of these that we're going to dive into, the inner workings and how to use them, how to set them up. So definitely register for our upcoming webinars if you haven't already done so.
Hey, Chris, there was a question in the Q&A on the previous slide about passwordless being more secure and more convenient than 2-factor. It seems a little like a bold statement. Can they be used together, or would they be used together?
Yeah. So passwordless, don't. As we dive through the details here, you'll see a little bit better. But passwordless is not a single factor authentication. So just because I'm saying, hey, passwordless is more secure than MFA, it doesn't mean MFA is not a piece. The concepts behind MFA are not a piece of passwordless. So passwordless is considered a strong credential, which means it has a multi-factor component to it. So definitely not a weak or a single factor. It doesn't present the same risks or vulnerabilities as a username password combination. But yeah, it takes pieces of multi-factor, and hopefully I have a slide later that I think will help describe and demonstrate why that is. Okay, so getting into the nuts and bolts. So what is passwordless authentication? What makes it work? There's 2 main components to passwordless authentication. There's the WebAuthn or web authentication component, which is typically like a web browser on the client, like JavaScript API. But WebAuthn is platform independent. It's not a Microsoft thing. It's not a Firefox thing. It's not a Chrome thing. It's a platform independent protocol. But what it is, WebAuthn, is it pretty much allows authentication to internet services without using a password, but rather that asymmetric cryptography, that public and private key pair method. And then the other component of passwordless is the client to authenticator, or CTAP2 protocol, and that controls communication between the client and authenticator. Now, you don't really need to worry yourselves too much with these 2 components, but that's what makes up Passwordless, and I'm going to walk through how the process actually works. So the first thing that you need to do when you try to set up a passwordless authentication method is you have to register it. If I go buy a FIDO2 security key, it's not just going to be able to log me into my account. I have to register it. So the first thing I need to do is, at least in this example here, I have to use that WebAuthn client. Again, this is going to be the browser on my desktop that I'm trying to use right now. And I have to try to authenticate to some web service or whatever service I'm trying to authenticate to, like SharePoint Online or Exchange Online. And that's considered the WebAuthn reliant party. So in our case, that reliant party, if I'm using SharePoint as a service I'm trying to set my credential up for, that's going to be Azure AD. That's the identity provider underneath SharePoint Online. So that's going to be considered as the role of the reliant party in this example. So Azure AD is going to respond back to the WebAuthn client or the browser with some information. And some of this is going to be some parameters that identify what type of passwordless authentication method or device, some of the things that device has to be able to do. It's different capabilities that have to exist on that authenticator device. So an example of this might be that the reliant party may say, hey, an authenticator has to provide some type of local authentication, like a PIN code or a biometric gesture to be able to unlock the credential. So that's a requirement that's dictated by the reliant party. But some other information that makes up this response is something that's called a nonce, and it sends back the reliant party ID. And I'll get into that here in a minute as we walk through the authentication flow. But right now, this is the first step to the registration of our authenticator. So what happens next is the browser checks for an available authenticator on the device, right? It could be Windows Hello, which means that's where this platform authenticator piece comes into play. But in this example, I'm using what's called a Roman authenticator. And this would be that FIDO2 security key. And it has different interfaces available for those keys. And we'll dive into those on the session dedicated to FIDO2 keys. But you have USB, you have near field, and you have Bluetooth as optional or available interfaces to a Roman authenticator. So the Roman authenticator means nothing more than it's an external hardware device that's not built into the computer that you're using with the browser. So what happens is that the requirements sent by the reliant party are validated against the authenticator, and then the authenticator creates a new key pair, a private key and a public key. And these are created on the authenticator itself, not within the desktop or the client, on the authenticator itself. The public key is combined into what's called an attestation object. And this is just nothing more than some additional information as part of the response. This contains things like the credential ID or other details that uniquely identify this specific authenticator. And when I say authenticator, and I'll be using that term quite a bit, the authenticator is that FIDO2 key. It is the Windows Hello, the trusted TPM chip in the laptop, or it's the Microsoft Authenticator app. The authenticator is just that device that's storing the passwordless credential. So the attestation object is returned to the WebAuthn client or the browser. In this case, it could be any browser, right? But when the WebAuthn client receives that, it's pretty much just going to send it back to the reliant party. It's kind of a middleman. It's just going to receive a response back from the authenticator and pass that on to the reliant party. The reliant party then stores the public key of the credential that was sent to it. But it also validates the attestation object because that object was signed, digitally signed, by the authenticator's private key. Now, the private key did not leave the authenticator, right? The private key here still exists only on the authenticator. It never left it, was never communicated. Only the public key was. So the reliant party is going to validate the signature on the attestation object because the public key is the only thing that really can validate that digital signature. If it's the wrong public key, that validation fails and the relying party doesn't trust the response. Did that, oh, sorry, the screen is lagging. I didn't know if that actually went through. Okay. So I think I actually didn't click. That's where the attestation object is being sent back to the relying party and it's validating. There we go. So once the relying party trusts that key, it trusts the digital signature, it stores it. That's pretty much the registration process. But how does then the authentication actually work? So my Roman authenticator, that FIDO2 key is now registered. It has my credential, which pretty much says it has a private and public key pair associated to my account. So what happens during the authentication process? So during authentication, I don't even need, the authentication process kicks off. It doesn't even need to know who my username is in some cases. It doesn't need to know my username. It doesn't need to know anything about me other than I'm trying to initiate a passwordless authentication process, right? So in this case, I'm using that same browser. I'm going to try to log into SharePoint Online or Exchange Online, whatever you have. So I go to my browser and I go to the SharePoint Online site, and on the web page, you might be familiar with the sign-in page for Office 365. It's going to ask you to type in your username, but there's a little box at the bottom that has sign-in options, and I'll actually demo that out in our Windows Hello sessions coming up. But in that sign-in options box, it gives you the option to select a passwordless, or I'm sorry, a security key sign-in option. And when you click that, it initiates this passwordless authentication workflow. So the authentication workflow starts with the relying party, again, Azure AD in this case, creating an assertion that is signed by the authenticators. I'm sorry, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. The first step outside of the registration process is that the relying party creates a challenge or a nonce. You might have heard me say that during the registration process, because this is technically the same. It creates a nonce, and a nonce is a randomly generated value that the relying party sends and expects to have returned from the authenticator. And that random generated value is nothing more than a way for the relying party to say, hey, this is a unique authentication attempt. And as we step through the additional steps here in the authentication workflow, you'll kind of see why that nonce value becomes important. But the relying party, Azure AD, is going to send a nonce and some other details, but the main thing is the nonce gets sent back to the WebAuthn client or the browser. The WebAuthn client detects the presence of an authenticator. So in this case, again, our FIDO2 security key. The authenticator finds a credential that matches the relying party. So as part of that nonce that was sent by the relying party, there's an attribute called the relying party ID. That's sent along with the nonce. So the authenticator looks at that relying party ID and says, hey, I've got a credential stored on here that matches that relying party ID. So because Azure AD required certain requirements around the capabilities of the authenticator, one of those requirements is that you have to unlock the credential. So this is going to prompt the user to enter in a PIN or some form of a biometric scan, like a fingerprint or a facial scan, to unlock that private key. The authenticator can also require an additional step, like a gesture of some type, which is maybe just even a tap on a touch sensor, not necessarily a fingerprint scanner, but just a touch sensor. And what this does is it provides proof of presence that you're with the physical key. For biometrics, you're going to have to be present anyways, because if you're going to have your fingerprint scanned, you have to touch something. If you have to have your face scanned, you have to be physically in front of the camera doing that, or the device doing that. So those kind of match that proof of presence as well. But if you just type in a PIN, what's to prevent you from typing in a PIN remotely? If you have remote access or remote control over a client like a Windows desktop, nothing. So that's where the the touch, the gesture, right? So even this not a fingerprint scan, it's just a touch sensor. You have to touch the key to prove that you are physically there with the key. Okay. So then what happens is the authenticator finds that stored credential because now it's been unlocked through the biometric or the PIN or the gesture. And then it creates a response and it sends the response back to the relying party. And this response is pretty much that nonce, but it's now digitally signed with the private key. So that private key signs that random value that was generated by the relying party and is pretty much just going to send it back to the relying party through the browser again. So the browser kind of acts as that middleman. It receives the response from the authenticator, but just pretty much passes it back to Azure AD in that case. Azure AD is going to see that response, and when it receives it, it's going to do a couple of things. It knows the public key associated with the credential. So it's going to use that public key to validate the signature, the digital signature on that nonce value or that nonce data. Is then going to validate that that nonce value matches the original nonce value that was generated at the very beginning of the passwordless workflow. And then it's going to verify that these responses contain some other information, such as like the relying party ID matches, and that's just an extra check to make sure that the response is being sent back or is being received for the same authentication attempt that was initiated by the relying party. Once all these things happen, once all those things have been verified, the signed credential is then used to authenticate the session from the browser or the WebAuthn client to the service. So you may have heard things that could be vulnerabilities like response replay, right? Could someone intercept that digitally signed nonce and replay it to Azure AD to try to fake it and saying, hey, I'm this person? Well, no, and that's where that nonce value and the digital signature comes into play. So yeah, they might be able to intercept that digitally signed response. So the nonce has already been digitally signed, but once that response is received by Azure AD as part of the real or the of course I'm drawing a blank on the word, the legitimate authentication attempt, that nonce value is no longer used, right? So when a bad actor tries to replay that signed nonce in an additional or a new authentication attempt, that authentication attempt is going to be created using a new nonce value, and those nonce values aren't going to match. So the relying party is not going to trust the response. So that's how we can kind of avoid response replay if someone would intercept that signed nonce or that signed response from the authenticator. So I know we're running up on time, so I'm going to try to get through this quickly, but that question came up around, is passwordless a single form of authentication? What makes it better than multi-factor, or is it multi-factor? And hopefully this slide kind of helps visualize how passwordless authentication does align with multi-factor authentication. So remember, a password or MFA is a combination of at least two of three things: something that you know, something that you have, and something that you are. Well, in this case, the main thing that we're using is something that you have, right? That's the authenticator, whether it's the security key, whether it's the authenticator app, whether it's the TPM chip in the device you're trying to authenticate from. There's something that is physical that you have. Now we're going to combine that, because to unlock that credential that's stored on that physical device, we have to provide something else. It could be a PIN, which is something that we know, or it could be a biometric, like a fingerprint or a face, and that is something that you are. So because we're using, they both may not be applying at like the Azure AD side of things, right? Azure AD might not be seeing, it's not kicking off to Azure MFA. Passwordless is an MFA credential because it is relying on at least two of those three things. And as we get into the other sessions, setting up Windows Hello for Business and FIDO2 keys, you'll also realize part of that registration process is actually very dependent on MFA. To register a passwordless credential, you have to be able to provide a strong credential, and a strong credential is one that's at least protected by MFA. So we'll dive more in that in the Windows Hello for Business and the Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator app and FIDO2 sessions. So hopefully, I talked through a lot there. Hopefully that helps solidify your understanding of what we're trying to solve with Passwordless, right? Why are we even having this conversation? Why do we need to know what it is? Why do we need to consider using it? I went through all those reasons why passwords are bad. I even went through some of the reasons why MFA is still great, but could use some improvement. And that's where Passwordless comes in. When we go through the other sessions on seeing it used, when someone logs in with Windows Hello for Business or they log in with a security key, it's a very convenient way to authenticate. So it's going to have large user adoption or willingness to use because it's going to be convenient, but at the same time, based on hopefully what you saw there in the workflow for the authentication process, it's a very secure way to authenticate. In that entire process, a password and a username were never, well, I'll say username with an asterisk. A password was never communicated back and forth. There is no password, right? So there's nothing to guess. It's all based on asymmetric cryptography. So I know I'm coming up on the hour, so I want to just really highlight real quick the remaining sessions of our Passwordless Authentication series. We're in the first one here, but we'll be doing our next one, was it next week already? On Passwordless with Windows Hello for Business, Part 1. We're going to dive into a lot of the details about how Passwordless with Windows Hello for Business works. What is Windows Hello for Business? What makes it run under the covers? And then there's so much to cover in that session. We have a part 2 for Hello for Business that's scheduled for Thursday, May 5th. And that's where we're going to walk through the actual setup, go through all the prerequisites, stand up the environment, and show you how it actually works in a real world scenario. And then our last session here will be Passwordless with the Authenticator app and FIDO2 keys, and that's scheduled for May 11th. And we'll do the same thing as we did with Windows Hello for Business. We'll go through the concepts and the details of what makes it work behind the scenes, but then how do we set it up and actually use it in a real world environment. We do also have another mini series, I guess, coming up, or if you want to call it mini series, coming up as part of our Zero Trust Concepts 2022 series. And that is going to be based on identity and device access. It's going to be looking at some of the access policies, recommended access policies around identity and devices to establish a baseline of security in your environment that aligns with zero trust principles and practices. So I appreciate everyone taking the time to attend today. Hopefully we'll see you in our upcoming sessions, but I guess at this time I'll ask Jim, do we have any questions that are outstanding or have not been answered?
No, we were able to answer all of the questions that were asked. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Well, again, hope to see you in our next upcoming webinar sessions. We will post the recording of this session to our Improvement CSP website. So if you want to go back and review it, you can. The link should be, go back here. Link is right here on our Improving Cloud Solution Provider websites. We'll have all the recordings posted there. But if you need to register for any of the other upcoming sessions, you can use this QR code to get to our registration page. So again, I appreciate everyone's time, and we will see you next time.